Welcome to Conversations with Cox and Kielseth, and to be more specific, that is filmmaker Alex Cox and myself, film curator Pablo Kielseth. Alex will join us by phone from his home in Oregon, while I sneak away from my office to call him from one of the projection booths used by the International Film Series, which has been screening foreign and independent movies at CU Boulder since 1941. We will keep our chats to about 20 minutes as we discuss whatever movie-related topics grab our fancy. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, action.
Hope those Ukraine girls really knock me out. They leave the West behind. And Moscow girls make me sing and shout. And Georgia's always on my mind. Oh, the phone's ringing. Who can that be? Pablo.
Alex.
Yes, hello. It's Steve. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Steve.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too.
So basically, for today's podcast, I invited my friend Steve Knopper. Steve and I go way back. We used to work on the high school newspaper together. Steve Knopper is a Denver-based editor-at-large for Billboard magazine. He is also a former and longtime Rolling Stone contributing editor, as well as the author of books such as Appetite for Self-Destruction, The Spectacular Crash of the Record Business in the Digital Age. So I just thought it'd be fun to just have him go to internationalfilmseries.com and have him actually check out one of our music related movies, or documentaries, of which we have quite a few, but the one that specifically the three of us will be discussing today is it's ZAPPA, about Frank Zappa. It's directed by Alex Winter, who most people will remember as the actor who played Bill in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. But he's also been doing a lot of heavy lifting with some recent documentaries that include stuff about the deep web, which was about the online black market. That was called Silk Road. But what we have now is in front of us, ZAPPA. It's being billed as the first time that a documentary has been given all access to the archives, and it premiered. It was set to premiere, I should say, at the 2020 South by Southwest Film Festival. It also set another record for the most money ever raised via a Kickstarter campaign for a documentary. And it was released here in the United States just a couple weeks ago by our friends at Magnolia Films. And for those who are uninitiated in what's going on right now in times of COVID, small distributors are basically trying to help out small exhibitors such as the International Film Series, which I program. And if when Steve Knopper went and saw ZAPPA, he paid $12, $6 of which went to the International Film Series, $6 goes to Magnolia. And so that's it. I saw it like a week ago. Knopper saw it, I think, either today or yesterday. Alex, when did you see it?
I saw it yesterday.
Ah, excellent. And I was telling Steve that as was something you told me previously on a previous podcast, you interviewed Frank Zappa when you were a young man.
I had a kind of a part-time job at BBC Radio Merseyside, and I would go out and interview people. I was like roving reporter with a Nagra, and I interviewed, among the other rock and roll people that I managed to get into, I interviewed Frank Zappa at the Liverpool Stadium. This must have been like in 1972. And I remember he seemed like a very intelligent man, and I asked him if he liked playing the piano, and he said absolutely not. It's just pushing buttons.
And what was there anything new that you discovered about Zappa from watching the documentary that you didn't already know, or?
I didn't realize how seriously he took himself. I mean, boy, all of that endless archiving. He's got a copy of every audio recording he ever made, and it's got all labeled and everything. Oh, yeah. Dear. I mean, I guess I should have guessed, but I didn't realize.
Yeah. What about for me? I think one of the things that's interesting is how he's kind of more of an orchestrator. What I liked was knowing that he kind of wanted to be a film editor. Like that was the creative genesis for a lot of his, what came after, is that I actually did like seeing some of the early footage that he put together, edited together.
What did our guest think of the show?
Yeah, Steve, what was your take?
Well, I'll be interested to hear more about what Alex has to say, because I associate Alex with punk rock, and I think Frank Zappa is, in certain attitudes, very punk rock, but in his musical approach, he's the opposite of that. The thing I got from this documentary is just how uncompromising he is. Like, he would just want to orchestrate things in exactly the complex, complicated ways that he heard it in his head. And a lot of times most of the time that made for incredible music, but it also took a toll on his relationships, and it seems like he applied that standard to almost every facet of his life. And so that was something that came up a lot in the movie, and I found that super interesting. I thought it was a pretty, something that was, I think his family obviously cooperated on this and gave Alex Winter access to, home movies and footage and so forth. I thought there was a certain amount of warts and all portrayal in all the facets of his personality.
Well, it was interesting because I had listened to Zappa records back in the day, because I could take albums home from the Radio Merseyside, from the radio station. So I'd taken home a bunch of Zappa stuff. I listened to Reuben and the Jets, I think, was my favorite. But I mean, the Hot Rats and We're Only in It for the Money and all that stuff from around that period. And seeing this documentary made me realize that Zappa was part of that movement. Although you say there was a punky attitude and some of the lyrics were very funny, but he was really part of what we called in England prog rock, which was like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes. It was guys who revered classical music and kind of thought rock and roll was a bit embarrassing and were above that stuff, And I was always more of the sugar pie, honey bunch. I was never quite up there in that sphere. So it distanced me a bit from Zappa to see all the archiving and the kind of the self-reflexivity of it and the reverence for obscure European composers and of course black R&B musicians, but nothing for Elvis, nothing for the Beatles, setting himself up in competition with the Beatles absurdly, So in that sense, you're right, it was warts and all, and it was interesting. It was interesting to see.
What about the political component? Because they do show they go into the back in August of 1985 when there were 19 record companies that agreed to deal with or put parental guidance, explicit lyric labels on albums, warning consumers about explicit lyrical content. And so we see some footage of Frank Zappa and like his cohorts in front of the senators at the time were folks like Dee Snider and John Denver. So what'd you think of that component, Alex?
Well, what do you think of it? I mean, I just felt that's kind of he's part of a scene, it's like what position musicians take over copyright, and some of them are huge defenders of copyright and some of them think, you can have the Motorhead point of view or you can have the David Bowie point of view, and they're very differing positions. What did you think?
It's so interesting to me that you mentioned I was just listening to some Motorhead this morning, Alex. But I want to rope Steve Knopper in on this one because what I remember of the 1985 sort of thing with the musicians versus the Senate was that there was a component that actually brought in Jello Biafra, who was the lead singer of the Dead Kennedys, who's from Boulder, and who went to Boulder High, where,
Really? I thought he was from San Francisco. He went to Boulder High?
he moved to San Francisco, where he then also became the founder, or
of the DKs. But I had no idea that he was from Boulder. How interesting.
Yeah, so he's basically an alum of the same, high school where Steve and I went. But what I recall, and Steve, here's where I want you to check me out. But he was being called in front of there because the Dead Kennedys had this album cover that had been designed by the guy who designed Alien, H.R. Geiger, and Penis Landscapes, I think it was, and that was what brought him into it. But the weird thing is that none of that gets mentioned in the Zappa documentary. But also, I just wanted to double check with you, since you might have a better memory of this. Was Jello part of? Was he there alongside Dee Snider and John Denver, or did he not actually get in front of the Senate to?
Yeah. I'd have to double check that. I don't think Jello Biafra was involved in the PMRC hearings at the time, the ones that, because those were pretty focused, as Frank says in this documentary, on popular music. Prince was mentioned, and Wasp, and, people who had huge hits, which was not Frank Zappa and certainly not Jello Biafra. I think the H.R. Geiger Penis Landscape issue happened around the same time. It was in the 80s, and it was sort of like, this was in the air, like every, conservative people and all kinds of people. I mean, Al Gore and Tipper Gore, of course, who were liberal Democrats, were involved in sort of, we must restrict things so our children don't have to hear this terrible stuff.
Focus on the family on the right, I think, is at the time.
Yeah. Focus on the family kind of came later, but yeah, there were conservative and moderate liberal voices that were sort of going, what? You're talking about sitting and masturbating?
In support of censorship, then as now. Right.
And that's just, if you don't mind my continuing, that's what I meant when I was referring to Frank Zappa's attitude. Like, I agree with you, Alex, that it doesn't come out so much in the music, but in his public persona, especially during those interviews he gave and his presence in the PMRC hearings, he would call people assholes to their face. And, my older brother, Mark, is such an incredibly huge Frank Zappa fan that he used to arrange his LP collection in reverse alphabetical order. These top albums or anything, but so he's much more of a prog rock guy. Like he early on, when he was growing up, he loved Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And we've been arguing about that to this day, whereas I'm sort of like, come on, man, give me a 2-minute punk rock solo where people can barely even play their guitars. And he loves those Zappa kind of, there's a whole series of albums called Shut Up and Play Your Guitar. It goes up to 30, 40, 50 volumes. And my brother loves those. And I remember he's 10 years older than me. So I remember as I was a kid in the 70s, kind of absorbing all this different, Frank Zappa music, some of which was this hilarious, Dynamo Hum and Apostrophe and all the classic hilarious stuff. And others, just this really hard to kind of put your finger on classical kind of experiments.
Hey, did you ever have a copy of Lou Reed's Metal Machine music?
Did he have that? He loved Lou Reed as well. I don't think he made it to Metal Machine music.
I've got a copy.
I had a copy.
I remember Lou Reed saying that he knew, that he felt really embraced by by Japan when he flew to Japan, and when he settled, his plane came down and he came out of the airplane, and there were all these people, and they actually were playing on these ghetto blasters, like Metal Machine music. Yeah. That's how he knew he was being properly welcomed.
And for those who haven't enjoyed that music, it's purely experimental, like guitar noise for like 4 sides of an LP. But it's pretty entertaining if you're into that kind of thing.
Yeah, just quickly, because if people are listening, and since you both
are you sure?
Well, there's a handful. But I do, since we're talking about music-related documentaries, I just wanted to let folks know that what we do have available currently on the website, it's not just the Zappa thing. We also have The Changing Times of Ike White. We also have something for Harry Chapin, When in Doubt, Do Something. Beatles in India, Herb Albert, Gordon Lightfoot. And recently we added, and I just wanted some quick input from Alex on this, but we have a documentary called Crock of Gold, A Few Rounds with Shane MacGowan. And you of course, you had the Pogues when Alex, when you shot, Straight to Hell, and you got all your musicians together, and that included the Pogues. I just wondered if you had any 2 cents about the Pogues before
They wrote music for Straight to Hell. They were actors in Straight to Hell. They wrote music for Sid and Nancy, and I did a pop promo for them back in the day for a song called A Pair of Brown Eyes. And I think this is the documentary by Julian Temple.
It is, correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and Julian Temple goes back a long way. He was like a pioneer rock video guy, and he directed features like Absolute Beginners and has done a number of music-related documentaries, including one about Joe Strummer and now one about Shane MacGowan of the Pogues. And so... And I think, I've licensed a clip from Straight to Hell for the documentary, so it's got to be good, right? It must be an excellent documentary,
Well, I anytime I watch any movie or documentary and there's a lot of music clips, I always think of you, because you made it very clear to me how expensive it is to license music clips, and I was surprised to see how many pretty big name acts in terms of the music clips that were being licensed for the Crock of Gold. It's like, because Creedence Clearwater Revival and U2, but I think it helped that Johnny Depp was the executive producer, and he also does an introduction for it. So I'm pretty sure Johnny...
Oh man, you're kidding! And I gave him a break on the price. There you go. You see how the artist always gets exploited, because it turns out that Johnny Depp is behind the thing, and I gave them a break on the price.
Well, it was probably the right, hey, it was so for Shane. Pissed. It was for Shane, not for Johnny, right? Shane
gets a share of it. Straight to Hell is a cooperative, and the money ultimately gets shared out when there's enough to be worth sending people a check.
Oh, well,
anyway, that's another story. The cooperative of Straight to Hell is another story. But Shane MacGowan is a very, very interesting and long-lived and eccentric character, and I bet the documentary is quite fascinating. In fact, I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Well,
on the IFS site.
That's correct. Well, we can maybe discuss that one next time. In the meantime, it looks like we're up to 20 minutes here. Any closing remarks, Steve, on Zappa?
Let's see. I thought it was a really intimate biography of Zappa. I mean, like I say, I don't know nearly as much about him as my brother does, but I learned a lot. The stuff about James Baker and Czechoslovakia at the end kind of blew my mind. I had no idea that Frank's connection to Czechoslovakia was pissing off James Baker, and that his connection to the PMRC, Baker was upset and told Czechoslovakia to stop associating with Frank Zappa. That was the revelatory moment for me. That was super interesting.
That is interesting.
I actually have to confess that one thing that I have never seen 200 Motels, and I will say that seeing all that stop motion animation with the claymation, it did make me want to see it. Have either of you seen 200 Motels?
No, I haven't.
At some point, I'm just going to have to dig that one up. That's
IFS must have shown it, surely, at some point.
Well, surely, but probably before my time. I missed it. Yeah. But I like claymation. So and that had the guy who they brought on to do that was clearly very possessed.
So he was an intense character.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you both for joining for this podcast on Zappa, and
thank you, Steve. And come back and let's talk about the Shane MacGowan thing if you're interested.
Thank you, Alex and Pablo. Really quickly, I just want to say, Alex, you probably get this a lot, but I saw Repo Man for the first time in high school at Pablo's mutual friend's Ben Brill's house in Boulder. and it changed my life, as did the soundtrack. So thank you very much. It's an honor.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'll talk to you, Alex, again very soon.
Good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
And cut. Okay, that's a wrap.
Thanks again for joining Alex Cox and myself today. I'd like to thank Jason Phelps for handling the audio and Ted Thacker for letting us use the intro to his song, The Ballad of Slim Cessna, for the musical cues that bookend these conversations.